Good evening. Thank you for weathering this torrential rain to be here with us tonight. And I am so delighted that we finally have Dr. Chase Robinson, Director of the Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art, with us. We've been working on this for a while, and he has found time in his busy schedule to be with us here in Hong Kong at the Asia Society to talk about a subject that I'm sure you're all very interested, what our National Museum for. And those of you who, I know I see some museum colleagues, professionals, as well as students, as well as our members, and I'm really delighted that you are, you are here to hear from our distinguished speaker, who's coming all the way from Washington, D.C. And you've probably also read about the very exciting news that was in the paper about 2 weeks ago about the transfer, the Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art, the deaccession and the transfer of this 子弹库 silk manuscript back to China, to the National Cultural Heritage Administration of People's Republic of China. This is really interesting silk manuscript, which is older than the Dead Sea Scroll, and it's something very unique. And I have to confess, not being in this field, I did not know anything about it, so I Googled it today, and it's 子弹库, which is very appropriate for being here at the Ammunition Depot, Asia Society here. We're our former explosive magazine, 军火库. So the 子弹库 fits the topic. We can ask Chase more about that in his presentation. But we're also very delighted that today's program, thanks to the Bei Shan Tang Foundation for sponsoring tonight's talk, and we will have Dr. He Jianfei, who holds a PhD in historical anthropology, and Jianfei is part of the Bei Shan Tang Foundation. She has been involved with Bei Shan Tang Foundation in terms of initiative that has nurtured emerging talent, including the J.S. Lee Memorial Fellowship Program, the Forum for Curators for Chinese Art, and the Bei Shan Tang Doctoral Thesis Grant. So thank you, Jianfei, for agreeing to moderate tonight's talk. And I think before I bring Dr. Robinson up, and I have to mention that I think this museum is probably one of my favorite museums. Some of you know I have family in the D.C. area. So whenever I'm back in Washington, D.C., this is one of the museums that I always try to stop by. And I usually mean to stop by and see a few things, and I end up spending hours, much to the chagrin of my family. But it is filled with treasure troves of Asian art, and really every time there is always some interesting exhibitions going on. And one of the things that I've discovered recently from my sister is that the third Thursday of every month, the Peacock Room. Those of you who aren't familiar with that beautiful room at the museum, its shutters opens every third Thursday of every month. But unfortunately, I have not been able to find, I've not been back in D.C. around the right time, so I have not seen it yet. For those of you, if you have an opportunity to be in Washington, D.C., third Thursday of every month, please take a look. Apparently, it is just wonderful to see that room come to life with natural light, and that is something that is really uniquely, it's one of the treasure, a highlight of that beautiful museum. And so with that, I'm really delighted that we have Dr. Robinson, who is going to tell us, we're going to start off with a presentation from him, and then it'll be followed by a kind of a fireside chat with Jianfei. And with that, thank you all for coming, and Dr. Robinson.
Good evening. I'll begin by thanking all of you for traveling through the biblical inundation that we're experiencing. I much appreciate it. Thank you very much, Alice. It's wonderful to be here. I appreciate your patience in getting this scheduled. Thank you to the Bei Shan Tang Foundation, Jianfei and colleagues for the invitation as well. I look forward to the conversation. A preliminary remark or two. I promise to speak for 20 or 25 minutes, and I hope to leave as much time as possible for conversation and questions from the floor. Second, I should say it's a particular pleasure to be here at the Asia Society, given that I started some travels about 12 or 13 days ago in Korea, and then was in Japan for a few days, and now I find myself back in Hong Kong, one of my very favorite places. I think it's the 5th time I've been in China in the last couple of years, which says something about the significance of China for our collection, but also the significance of China in our thinking. Perhaps a final introductory remark or two. You'll notice a disparity between the title on this first screen and the advertised title. That was not deliberate. That's, shall we say, some slippage. And if it was presumptuous enough for me to at least appear to be speaking about national museums, boy, it's really presumptuous for me to try to answer a question such as, what are museums for? I shall do no such thing. What I will do is share with you some reflections, some ruminations, considerations, maybe even some provocations. Ours, and thank you for the kind comments about our museum and the Peacock Room. Ours is an extraordinary national resource, America's first national art museum, in fact. But we do live in a time, and this is the gist of my comments, of deep transformation, and I'm a strong believer that institutions to thrive must transform. So, provocations, considerations, reflections, ruminations. The Smithsonian, as some of you may know, was founded in 1846. We currently consist of about 19 or 20 museums, depending on how one counts them. In a typical year, the Smithsonian attracts between 20 and 30 million visitors. Our museum opened in 1923 based on a deed of gift that was signed in 1906, which transferred to the Smithsonian and the United States the then still nascent collection of an industrialist named Charles Lang Freer, who built a collection, an extraordinary collection of Asian art, concentrated in East Asian art, a collection that he assembled mainly in the 1890s, between a collecting career that began around 1887 or 88 and ended in 1919 upon his death. Since then, we've had the great pleasure and privilege of functioning as the National Art Museum. The saying, of course, is if it's not broken, don't fix it. And our museum, for any number of reasons, is certainly not broken. Our attendance is up considerably from pre-COVID, which is great. Our budget is about 35% larger than it was 5 or 7 years ago. Our full-time staff is growing. We've added about 5,000 objects in the last 5 years. We're really prospering for any number of reasons, not the least of which is the public's fascination with things Asian, and of course the great work our staff does. But we are trying to be self-critical and introspective in a responsible way. In 2023, we celebrated our anniversary, and rather than just celebrating our past, we thought very much about our future. So, some reflections. good times and bad times, the best of times and the worst of times for museums, at least in some respects. Some of you may be familiar with these two relatively new, star-architected, extraordinary new museums in the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf. I've forgotten the nomenclature. It changes. A couple places with which you are more than a little bit familiar. Jean Nouvel, IMP, Frank Gehry. These and others, the kind of McKim, Mead, and White, one gilded age of museum building, comparable in some respects with another gilded age, the Gilded Age building to which the museum that I have the privilege of leading belongs. Why these great times? Well, for any number of reasons. Again, you who have the privilege of living in Hong Kong experience these things, and so will understand them in some respects better than those of us who live in what is becoming, used to be the new world, but sometimes it feels like the old world these days. Economies that are diversifying, attempts to grow considerably tourism, projects that can satisfy growing middle classes and elite tastes, especially in contemporary art. And of course, also, and this is of particular interest to me, a historian, attempts, some more successful than others, to what I'll call rewrite national narratives. The UAE is a very good example of a nation that's building museums to build new national narratives of cosmopolitanism, of internationalism, to develop Abu Dhabi as a city, state, and cultural hub. The best of times and the worst of times. But there are other parts of the museum sector, if one thinks about it as in a global sense, which are, shall we say, suffering. Museums going bust, a small sample. Museums under stress, even great museums under considerable stress. Infrastructure that is extremely capital intensive, stresses upon local budgets, national budgets, changing patterns of philanthropy are some of the pieces that explain the stresses of what I will call, shall we say, old world culture. The stresses also of coming out of COVID, where, as you can see, the bounce back has been slow and in many museums is incomplete. Here is just a sample of the kind of data, and there are mountains of data in the museum field in the United States that typically address a cluster of questions, some more alarmist, all concerning in one way or another. What do you anticipate will be the biggest disruptions to your business strategy in 25? Well, I've already mentioned shifts in philanthropy, a major challenge in the United States, financial and market instability, and of course this is data collected before the last 3 or 4, shall we say, eventful months in the cultural life of the United States. A black and white photo of our gallery as it opened in 1923. My great desire has been to unite modern work with masterpieces of certain periods of high civilization, harmonious in spiritual suggestion, having the power to broaden aesthetic culture and the grace to elevate the human mind. The words of our founding figure, Charles Langfreer. Of course, this reflects this statement of purpose, if I may, reflects a very different moment in museum history, a moment filled with certainties, a 19th century Gilded Age moment, as I've already intimated, a time of European and growing American hegemony, a time when the extraction of objects from lands subordinated culturally, politically, and economically was integral to imperialism, colonialism, and nation building, a time when opportunities to behold the beautiful, the singular, the exceptional, the exotic, in Freer's terms, masterpieces, when the opportunity to behold those objects was extremely rare, when elites, social and economic elites, had a monopoly or a near monopoly on determining standards of tastes, a very different world. And of course, ours is a time of extraordinary change. Ours is the time in which, what would Charles Lang Freer think of K-pop? What would Charles Lang Freer think of Bollywood? What would Charles Lang Freer think of a world which was not only interdependent and globalized, but in which East Asia and South Asia, and to some extent the Middle East, were driving global capitalism, driving tastes? I think you would have found it bewildering. Just a few days ago, I was in Osaka and I visited the Expo, a terribly interesting venue, which I commend to your attention if you're interested in how nations present themselves. Provided all sorts of interesting opportunities to understand how aesthetics, how tastes are changing. It was a space not only to view exhibits, but to co-create our future society. Very different set of assumptions about curation than those that drove our museum and typical museums. So I'm accentuating the change, but in many respects, and this is a little interlude of pedantry, if I may, I'm a former professor. In many respects, the change was anticipated. Some of you will know Walter Benjamin's extraordinary work occasioned by the development of photography. Just as water, gas, and electricity are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so shall we be supplied with visual or auditory images which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, one might say a swipe, hardly more than a sign. Paul Valéry, who did the preface. There we are, with our magic wands, with our magic instruments of consumption, which sometimes so get in the way of the museum experience as to wonder, why be in a museum when one chooses the intermediated experience of the, quote, smartphone, unquote. Just one of many ways in which our patterns of consumption are changing. We don't wait for a newspaper to be published or a book to be printed, for a television show to be broadcast, or for an exhibition to come. At least we try not to. We want images now, and we want those images on our phones 24/7, so that we can live and relive again our engagement, our moment of cultural consumption. It is interesting, curious, even quaint, I think, how art museums many times defend themselves by adducing the auratic power of presence while they pack more and more and more visitors, thus subverting the very power of the presence and the auratic that they're meant to be creating. We live in a world not only in which patterns of consumption, patterns of curation are changing, but also a world, and we see this acutely nowadays in the United States, where the loci of authority who speaks with power are really changing. A world of deep skepticism about legacy institutions, including museums. One can see it running through journalism, government, politics. The last 10 years have seen a radical reduction in the authority of universities, and now it has begun to hit the museum world. Let me begin to shift from critique to project. In the transition, a number of questions. Why should museums imagine that their social position and authority remain self-evident in the way they did 50 years ago or 100 years ago? Why should we imagine that? Why should we imagine that we have the same potency in delivering cultural capital when there are all sorts of new forms through which culture is produced and consumed? Why, indeed, should we operate within what I have come to call an economy of scarcity, predicated on the increasingly obsolete idea that the significance of an object lies mainly in its scarcity, exhibited behind thick walls, often for short-term exhibitions, the time-limited, get your tickets now, so that you can queue up for the blockbuster show, which of course, in the economy of the major museum and elsewhere, subsidizes all sorts of financial shortfalls otherwise. Allow me to race through some slides that give you some sense of where we're going as a museum in beginning to experiment and assemble a different model of what we're about. I'll say a few words about provenance and object history and the lives of objects. I'll say a few words about materiality, polyvocality, and collaboration. I'll be saying a few words about a broader approach. I suspect, Jianfei, we're going to return to this question of repatriation. Here's a piece which is of some interest, which is, as you can see, a bowl. It's a late 15th century bowl or wine cup, part of cargo that had traveled on a junk ship made of teak, which was headed towards the Philippines when it was struck by a typhoon and sunk. The boat remained in Vietnamese waters until 1993 when it was discovered by fishermen who recovered the ceramics and initially tried to keep the wreck a secret. In 1997, 2 Japanese dealers got involved. The authorities were alerted, and after retrieving the items from the floor of the South China Sea, they were inventoried, tagged with an excavation sticker, as you can see, and eventually made their way to museums across the world, including ours. This is from our collection. It was purchased by a collector and donated to our museum in 2005. That's in one of thousands of examples of the biography of an object very schematically presented. An example of the approach that we're taking in which we insist not on using the word provenance by itself, because that then triggers a number of associations about liabilities necessarily leading to return, but rather provenance and object history or object biography. A different example, an exhibition that's currently up in our museum on ancient Yemen. It's what I like to call a Janus-faced exhibition. Part of it looks to Yemen at the turn of the 1st century of the Common Era, extraordinary period of economic and artistic prosperity in South Arabia. But it's also an exhibition that shows some of the pieces that had been intercepted, confiscated, pieces that had been smuggled out of Yemen during the course of the violence in the last 20 years, and have now been legally repatriated to Yemen, but are on display in our museum, subject to co-creation, co-curation between our curators, the embassy, and Yemeni scholars. Our museum is going big into provenance and object history. We believe it to be an immensely important emerging area of museum practice. We're sponsoring any number of programs, research, projects, and the like. So that's in part by what I mean the broader approach that addresses an aspect of what we see as transforming appetites of ethical engagement. When visitors come to our museum, they often ask the question, where did this come from? And we're now trying to answer it. Another example of a broader approach I intimated is materiality. Conservation, we're bringing out from behind the walls of conservation labs. We're doing so in order to feed the tastes of those interested in science and transform that taste into an appreciation for art and vice versa. We're fortunate to have in our conservation lab not only conservators, but conservation scientists, that there is an appetite for this kind of materiality, precisely because so much of our reality is otherwise mediated. The last time I looked, there were 700,000 or 800,000 views of this very short conservation video. One might speak, as some have, of the return of the object. Here's another example, wonderful show curated by Jen Stewart, working in close collaboration with our conservators, which, as you can see from the photograph underneath, is as much about the conservation of the object as it is the object itself. So a second example of what I mean by a broader approach. A third, there is we're trying to re-engineer the balance between the centrifugal and the centripetal. We're trying our best to attract visitors to our museum, but to push museum content out. Our museum has the great good fortune of being open 364 days a year and completely free. And when I say completely, I really mean completely. We don't charge for any exhibitions, which is a fantastic public service. It also means we're liberated from the challenge or the temptation of, as I intimated earlier, subsidizing our operations with blockbuster shows. It also means that our website doesn't have to function as a vitrine to draw visitors. We push content out. Here's an example of some contented digital animation that we pushed out in a Japanese show recently. Another example, a major project on teaching China through objects in our collection, material that we're preparing for teachers and mainly in the United States middle school students. By broader approach in this respect, I mean one in which we stop hoarding, if I may, and start sharing. We abandon that economy of scarcity, mindful of what I find interesting, what psychologists call the mere exposure effect, that exposure to visual stimuli conduces to enjoyment of the stimulus. In other words, the more art you show people, the more art they want to see. By broader approach, I also mean opening the museum up. We live in a time, it's being temperamental, in which there is quite reasonably some anxiety about the public perception of Asian cultures. I myself, my own career straddles, my area of expertise is the Islamic Middle East. My entire career straddles 9/11 and all of its impact upon the public understanding of the Middle East and Islam. So this is something with which I have some interest. I cannot exaggerate how popular the celebration of Asian cultures is at our museum. We do a Lunar New Year celebration, which 16,000 people crowd into the museum over 3 or 4 hours in a celebratory mode. We do all sorts of other festival family days predicated for a museum that's so heavily invested in scholarship and research and exhibitions predicated on that very powerful mode of human agency called celebration. Finally, collaboration. What better place to speak of collaboration than here? We have launched any number of partnerships in Japan and Korea and Cambodia and Saudi Arabia, and these are multi-year, multimodal partnerships in which we take the view, again, in this decentered world, in which we do not claim, we do not reflect some of the underlying dynamics that drove the creation of great Western museums, that are driven instead by notions of co-curation and reciprocal knowledge sharing. I close with a shot of our centennial celebrations in 2023. And I close by inviting you, all of our museum, to judge for yourself as the museum transforms itself and tries to reflect the enormous dynamism of Asia, traditional, historical, past, present, and future. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Hi, Chase. Welcome. Welcome to Hong Kong, especially after that, your 2 weeks of grand tour in Asia. So right after the return and transfer of the Danku manuscript, you traveled to Saudi Arabia to formalize some MOU understanding. Would you mind telling us a bit more about your travel in Asia and how your activities out there and here in line with your mission and approach for the NMAA, the National Museum of Asian Art?
Very good. Thank you, and again, thank you for inviting me and having the opportunity to chat. Yes, as I've been joking recently, if I don't get back home, I fear my wife is going to change the locks to the house, as I've been gone so long. And it did begin with a short visit to Saudi Arabia. We've been working towards a collaboration with the Royal Commission of Al-Ula, part of the kingdom's Giga projects. Terribly interesting. Saudi Arabia, as some of you will know, for decades suppressed really the public appreciation of its extraordinary history. It is going through a period of extraordinary creative reinvention, which includes developing heritage sites, museums, both of historical material as well as contemporary art. And so we've begun to collaborate with the Royal Commission on the recovery of 2nd century, 1st century millennium material for exhibition. This trip I started in Seoul. There's several museums in Korea with whom we have active collaborations, and if any of you find yourselves in North America in November, I encourage you to come to our museum because we'll be opening a show based on the collection of Lee, the former chairman of Samsung, an extraordinary collection. He gave to Korea 20,000 objects, and 220 are going on exhibition in our museum. Also spending some time in Japan. Our Chinese collection and our expertise in Chinese have long been really rivaled only by the size of our collection and depth of our expertise in Japanese. Mr. Freer, that was his real passion. East Asia, we work closely with the Tokyo National Museum, increasingly with other institutions as well. What I'd really like to emphasize is how much the team and I learn, how many of our staff we encourage to spend time as part of partnerships and staff exchanges, how approaches towards interpretation and approaches towards heritage, towards art, towards display, how those ideas cross-pollinate and teach us a great deal.
Wow, it sounds like an interesting and inspiring trip. So you talk about a lot of long-term planning, strategic planning, and also challenges museum directors of any museum face in the world now. Those are amazing long-term planning, long-term strategic planning. But given the geopolitical climate and also these institutional resources inevitably turning inward, as we observed. So is there any barrier or hurdle that you can see at the horizon that can impact your short-term or mid-term plans? And so what keeps you up at night in maintaining all these intricate balance? And what's the strategic option if that something really happens?
So that's a hard question. It's a complicated question. So let me try to answer it in a couple of different ways. And I'll begin with the kind of analytical, and then perhaps I'll turn to the, if not the emotional, certainly the intellectual. The Smithsonian has been in business for nearly 2 centuries, and it plans and thinks in the long term. Our museum is similarly guided not so much by a kind of calculus of what makes sense in the short term, but rather what will pay dividends in the long term. Now, it would be obtuse of me to suggest that politics and policies, one thinks, for instance, of visas, do not constitute, at the very least, a variable that we need to think about. We're a museum devoted to understanding Asian art in traditions that begin in Japan and culminate in other forms in North Africa. And so we can be active in multiple spaces in such a way as to mitigate some risk. We also have the advantage, as do other museums, of being able to leverage technology and remote ways of communicating, so that we're less dependent upon shall we say, conventional forms of collaboration. So if we were a museum devoted to Chinese history and culture, it would be, I think, according to what you're suggesting, a particular challenge. But here's where I turn from the intellectual to the analytical to, I think, at least the quasi-emotional, which is, it's precisely now that we need to be investing. It's precisely now that we need to be fostering, in my view, and the view of my colleagues, the people-to-people, the cultural exchange. The benefits will accrue. They may not be manifest tomorrow or next month or next year, but they will accrue. And they'll accrue not only for those living in Hong Kong or elsewhere in Asia, but for us. The world is, and this is positively banal, but in its interdependence, but also in growing Asian American communities in the United States, there is a growing appetite for the kind of material we present. There's a growing appetite to celebrate and understand heritage of Asian heritage, diasporic heritages, and Asian American heritages, and I would regard it as derelict if we were to abandon that project, even if in the short term it presents certain challenges.
I guess this is the cultural diplomacy that people are talking about for maybe in the recent past 10 years. So speaking of cultural diplomacy, I think many of you, you are expected to elaborate a little bit more on the return, transfer, and the repatriation of the manuscript. Happened 2 weeks ago, and maybe the message that this event sent in the context of NMAA's responsibility and these, when you emphasize a lot about transparency and accountability, could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I suppose I could have devoted the entire presentation. We could devote the entire Q&A, if not to the object in question or the set of objects in question, but to certainly what they symbolize and how we affected them. So just for those of you who haven't been reading the news, as Jianfei said, about 2 weeks ago, we formally deaccessioned and transferred to China, to the Cultural Heritage Administration, what scholars call Volume 2 and 3 of the Chu manuscript, or the Zenko manuscript, which is a 3rd, early 4th century millennium BC extraordinary work, as Alice was describing, which gives an important glimpse into early Chinese writing, early Chinese thought, particularly magical thinking, into the origins of the book and the use of silk, an extraordinary object which art historians and archaeologists of China could do a much better job than yours truly in describing. The object itself came to the museum in 1992, was thoroughly published, collaboratively researched by conservators of ours who did terrific work. It came to the museum in an archaeological state, one might say. One of our curators referred to it as a kind of scrunchie. You can imagine a very poorly preserved silk object. Over years of painstaking work, they disaggregated it and made it suitable for study. Our museum has a strong collection in Chinese archaeological material, including in silk, but we are no longer carrying out active research on the piece. And it was our judgment, for several reasons, that it should be returned to China. One was to put it in the vicinity and in conversation with active research. Another was the ongoing research of Chinese scholars of an important nature with whom we wanted to collaborate. A third was its unsettled provenance, the circumstances in which it left China are, as I said, unsettled. It seems to have left in the 1940s. There are contesting claims about ownership, and we felt that in ways that are consistent and try to advance our larger program of provenance and object history, that the best way to address that aspect of the object was also to return it. The discussions that took place that resulted in the return were, and this is an experience that we at the museum really felt humbled, and I use the word quite deliberately, to participate in, were of utmost respect and collegiality and constructive engagement. And yes, I think given the circumstances, there was a certain power and resonance to the ability of professionals coming to a single voice, a single view about the disposition of an extraordinarily important object for Chinese civilization. So we felt, as I said, humbled, but at the same time, really pleased to be able to work with our colleagues. And as a result of the agreement, we'll be doing even more research on provenance of Chinese material and the circulation of objects amongst dealers in China in the 1910s and 1920s.
So as far as I know, the manuscripts will be displayed in National Museum of China in July, and also maybe, I don't know, hopefully we return to its birthplace in Hunan Museum in Changsha. And will you be there for the...
I will. I look forward to it.
So is there any plan for future collaborative research projects? Because, as you said, that manuscript has been researched and studied for in the past 40 years, actually, and there are volumes of books that documenting the conservations and the decipher of the Li Shu seal script on the pieces. Is there any further plans in, like, not so much as knowledge generation, but knowledge transferation within NMAA and also in China? Because I think you mentioned that the NMAA keeps the intellectual property also. So is there any more things you would do with that information of those pieces, even though physically they were returned to China?
Oh, the agreement certainly creates a framework for ongoing collaboration. When we retain intellectual property, that doesn't mean we keep it private. We share virtually all of as much of the research that we generate as possible, and that's certainly the case when it comes to the manuscript fragments. I think it's likely that there will be some ongoing work on the part of our conservation scientists in support of Chinese research. I think our principal kind of research agenda coming out of this deaccession and transfer will be in opening up access to archives and research materials so we can do a better job understanding the circulation, translocation of similar and even dissimilar objects in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. As some of you who do provenance research may know, that's an area of real obscurity. And the resources, the archives, they're in China. They're not in Washington, D.C. So that will occasion all sorts of collaborations, we hope.
So ever since we knew you, you expressed extensively on your interest and your belief in object history and also provenance research. You also mentioned that there will be other categories in Chinese art that would be research on, like in depth, in terms of the provenance and object history. And also, I think in the past few years, the NMAA actually you designed and create a position for provenance researcher. Could you say a little bit more about the idea behind this position? And so what's the relationship or dynamic within the museum when people are thinking about like curators, curatorial research, and provenance research? Because traditionally for curators, they to research and investigate the life history of the artifact is part of their job, work, right? So what's the difference between, or connections between these two positions, and how's the dynamic?
So as a very practical matter, I'd be astonished if there are any curators in the room who would disagree with the proposition that curators are already overworked, right? But there's a more serious aspect to an answer, which is that, yes, to some extent, it was within the conventional responsibilities for a curator to undertake some measure of provenance research. But that was always subordinated to other responsibilities. That was never, and it's still not, part of the great majority of formal training in, it does not figure prominently in PhD programs in art history, does not even figure prominently in most American situations, different in the UK, different in Europe, changing. But the particular skills necessary, which are mainly archival and historical rather than art historical, to do provenance research. The more interesting part of my answer, I think, is this is how new academic fields get created. They break off from pre-existing fields. Why is our museum making the investments it is? You're right, we just hired our first ever associate director for provenance. We have a team of 4, which for a museum of our size is very large, and it'll be growing. It's for 2 reasons, and I gestured in this direction in my presentation. One is, it is irresponsible for any museum in 2025 to assume, A, that the entirety of its collection, if its collection is sourced from somewhere else, is necessarily of sound provenance, and B, does not integrate contemporary standards of acquisition into its acquisition policies, because we continue to collect. Historical liabilities, but also eliminating risk and carrying out ethical collection practices. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, to which I also alluded, is that this is not only an emerging area of interest for professionals, but many of our visitors really do want to understand these object biographies. Many, of course, are interested in shall we say, more conventional aesthetic or art historical questions, but they're fascinated by the circulation of objects within Asia. They're fascinated by the intersection of collecting history and colonialism, capitalism. They are fascinated by the the overlap between a biography of an object and institutional history and the history of collecting. So it is not just an emerging and nascent discipline, but it's increasingly an aspect of presentation and interpretation that we put into practice in our galleries. If you come to our galleries, you'll find galleries that are conventional in some respects, but you'll find other galleries in which there's a lot of experimentation taking place. For instance, labels that are not written by curators, but instead are written by members of the community, or galleries in which object histories really have an important role because of the nature of the objects. So, for those two reasons, we're really seeing this as an important aspect of not just our practice, but trying in our own way to exercise some sector-wide leadership.
So, as a committed educator and scholar, I believe that whether cultural diplomacy or provenance research, object history, is a means to an end. So, what does the end looks like? So, I guess what I meant was, what is a success project, provenance research project? So other than the knowledge generation, so the research you do, but how do you get the message out? And what's your expected outcome of the research project in general? What does success look like? I guess my question is.
So So I'll try to answer that in two ways, in a very specific and then a broader way. The specific answer or aspect would be, we were just, for instance, 2 years ago given an important set of archives related to the immensely important dealer J.T. Tai. That'll be a name familiar with you. There might be 20 or 30 years worth of research embedded in that archive. It could produce, and I say this not as someone who's a scholar of Chinese collecting in the 20th century, but as a historian, so you can discount my view accordingly. There might be 5 or 10 PhD dissertations embedded in the full exploration of that archive. So what does success look like answer in that respect is a much fuller understanding of networks of exchange, which moved pieces within Asia into European markets and North America, into public, private collections, museums. A much fuller understanding of how the value, monetary but cultural, of those objects changed as they traveled through those circuits and networks of exchange, and much more besides. So. I think there's again, the broader answer is our museum, which enjoys public funding. The majority of our funding is private, but we do receive public funding. We're part of the trust instrumentality. It's an arrangement in which we are quasi-public. We enjoy the public's trust, and we should enjoy the public's trust, and unless we're responding to those transforming standards, and responding affirmatively, I think we stand to lose the public trust. My daughter, when she buys a pair of jeans, she asks herself, were these ethically manufactured? Where were they? Under what conditions did they come to be? I think ethical consumption and those ethical considerations have to be central to museum practice, which is not to say it's easy, which is not to say we always get it right, which is not to say that standards now are the only standards that we'll obtain. I'm humbled by the thought that our best efforts now may very well be seen in 10 or 20 years as woefully inadequate, but we're going to be moving in that direction.
Sounds like you're introducing change and transformation in a very powerful and successful institution. So my next question is, what's the most difficult decision you made in terms of a decision that creates the most leverage in the past 5.5 years of your leadership?
So full disclosure, I had a tip off of that question. Not all of them, but that one I did. And what I said to Jianfei at the time is, it's a hard question. I mean, I've said that of many of your questions. So I'll try to discriminate between, I'll give you an example of a decision that on its merits was not difficult, but in its execution was difficult. Some of you will be familiar with our museum not as the National Museum of Asian Art, but as something else. The Freer-Sackler. We were the Freer-Sackler since 1987. We were the Freer Gallery of Art since 1923. Changing the name of an institution, changing its brand, is hard. Changing the brand and the name of a really successful institution is really hard for any number of reasons. So on its merits, it was absolutely clear to me that we needed to do it. And the reason we need to do it is that we had very good data that showed that as much as the Jianfeis of the world understood exactly who we are, well, you don't represent most visitors to the National Mall, for whom Freer-Sackler was utterly opaque. We had very good visitor data that showed that the great majority of even those who consume culture and go to museums did not know that the United States had a national art museum. So this is why it was kind of self-evident on its merits, clear that we needed to change the name. There was also, again, try to operate within as much candorous transparency as I can, a measure of, shall we say, controversy, if not infamy, attaching to the Sackler name. So for reasons of just telling our consumers who we were, our clients, our customers, if in that sense, the public, we needed to change the name. It is hard to change. It takes several iterations. It takes investments of time and energy. The Smithsonian is a glorious institution, but it's not an institution that is as agile, I don't think, as it might be. To repeat my answer to your question, clear on its merits, took three and a half years, and in some circles, including yours, it sometimes still retained the older name.
Right, yeah, you mentioned that you are revisionist by inclination, right? So on that note, I know it's behind schedule, right? So let's open up the question to the floor. Do you have any burning questions to ask Chase? When you raise the question, please identify yourself first. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Renee Chang with the Oriental Ceramic Society of Hong Kong. What kind of decision-making went into returning the manuscripts and what does it portend for all the other things that you have in your museum, which have a kind of, that were collected by Freer in the 19th century or whatever, that have a sort of, do not meet the requirements of how you would acquire things today. I think it was a quote from you about how you made your decision for about the 2 manuscripts.
Freer, as you may know, made his fortune in the railway car manufacturing business. He built railway cars, or he owned companies that built railway cars. And the reason he was so successful was that he we would now call him a monopolist. We have our own monopolies nowadays, but he was a late 19th century monopolist who affected all sorts of vertical and horizontal integration. His final great fortune-making move was to pull together, I think it was 13 separate railway car manufacturings into a huge, would now call it a conglomerate. It was a monopolizing project. How could he do that? He could do that because virtually all of the parts of his plants and his business operations were identical. Wheels of a standard size, axles of a standard size, framing of a standard size. It's interesting to me as a historian that his collecting project couldn't be more different. Every single object is unique. Mr. Freer initially collected woodblock prints, but he then he was also a great enthusiast for James McNeill Whistler and collected many lithographs and etchings of Whistler. So when it comes to Whistler, he stuck with prints. When it came to Asian art, and of course, as you know, in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, woodblock prints became immensely popular in Europe and the United States to some extent. Whistler himself collected prints. Freer would have none of it. Why? Because they were not unique the way the painting was unique, or the sculpture was unique, or the ceramic was unique. So all of that is by way of answering your question, which is every object has its own history. And what we do as a practical matter is to focus on those areas in which the provenance history is most cloudy, or we suspect most difficult, that is to say, potentially problematic, and we work through those first. We've got about 48,000 objects. We have a small and great team. We triage in terms of that first area that I talked about, the liability area. So the honest answer to your question is I don't know what it portends. We think about potential returns in the light, of course, of 1970 UNESCO Convention, but we also think of returns in the light of national patrimony laws, which differ from one country to the next radically. Some countries, and Egypt would be a good example, relatively early, Syria relatively early, other countries much later, in the 1960s, 1970s. So you've got an immense research project of unique objects, poor documentation, very different landscape of laws, and therefore a very uneven set of kind of legal and ethical questions. I will say this because that hasn't come up yet. I'm sorry to be so long-winded. I think it was in 21 or 22, the Smithsonian introduced a framework for ethical returns, which complements legal returns. So we now have the facility to make ethical returns per policy, which we didn't necessarily have before. So it's ongoing research. It is a certainty that returns will continue to be made as a matter of course in museums if they're conducting themselves, as the great majority do, with the kind of responsibilities that they've been invested in with.
This lady in the front. Thank you. My name is Shirley, and I'm definitely a fan of the Smithsonian. Although I'm more familiar with the Cooper Hewitt, having studied in New York. I guess in the beginning you shared with us the modern spectacle of people consuming through their phones, etc. And you also shared a lot of stories about, I guess, in a way, the relevance of the modern museum. So how do you balance that to Freer's original vision of, getting people to think and idolizing artworks versus how people, especially younger people, care about experiences or how they consume culture? So how do you balance that fine line between these two visions? Thank you.
It's interesting. I'm tempted to turn the question around. I mean, I think you're right. We do try to balance it, but I do find myself sitting right here wondering, why do we try to balance it? Why do we try to remain faithful to what is in some respects an obsolete set of assertions about beauty or masterpieces? We do it, I suppose, because our culturally, institutionally, our history kind of tells us to do it. We don't want to betray the man who was so generous and so visionary in some respects, and the man, it must be said, who kind of repudiated, and this is interesting and maybe the beginning of an answer to your question, at the time, his aesthetic vision was very different from contemporary ones. He had no interest in the kind what he regarded as flashy blue and white export wear. The better answer to your question is that we're experimenting. We don't know. We collect visitor data. We do a lot of surveys. What did you find engrossing? What did you find most impactful in terms of your learning? So we ask questions, collect data. We experiment. We design different kinds. You won't find uniform displays. You'll find some exhibitions that are immersive. We're not on the cutting edge here. Some more participatory, interactive than others. Some quite conventional. I think we're mindful of the fact, or at least we try to be, that people come to museums for lots of different reasons. Sometimes to look at beautiful objects, sometimes to learn, sometimes to spend time with their grannies, sometimes to get away from, the noise and hubbub of the city. Sometimes to celebrate Chuseok, Korean Harvest Festival. So maybe it's not so much balancing as trying in a sustainable way to offer options.
Maybe the gentleman in the middle.
Sammy Lee from Hong Kong Baptist University. Thank you so much for shedding light on some of the most important development directions of the a national museum. So I'm just wondering, with the new branding of the NMAA, and as we know that there are many different nationalities or ethnicities in Asia. So I'm just wondering, for regarding NMAA, what's the priority of outstanding or pinpointing which region of the exhibits to be exhibited, and what comes into the priority of for example deciding the special exhibitions out of this regular exhibition, what comes into priority when you are balancing the different regions or different ethnicities or nationalities of Asia. Thank you.
Really, these are all terrific questions. They're hard questions. They don't admit, for the most part, straightforward answers. So let me give you, let me answer by giving you a problem that we're trying to solve, which is the great strength of our tradition has been, as I already said, in East Asian and aspects of South Asian and Islamic material culture. We have a smaller collection of Southeast Asian material, and we've had a smaller collection of Korean material, extremely good but narrow collection of Korean material. So very excited and proud of the fact that we just hired our first ever curator of Korean art, and we've also just hired our first permanent curator of Southeast Asian art. That now means that we need to embark upon a considerable expansion of those two collections. Well, that's easier said than done, in part for market reasons and in part for provenance-related reasons. In the case of Korean Americans, Washington is, I think, third largest concentration of Korean Americans. By far the largest is in Los Angeles, New York. In the case of Southeast Asian, Washington, D.C. is large populations, Vietnamese, Cambodians, etc. So we've got an obligation to them too, and to national Asian American communities. So how are we solving the problem? We're solving the problem in part by working with donors who are making gifts. For instance, we've got some spectacular donations that'll be made in Korean. But we're also building out modern and contemporary, and that would be particularly the case, I think, in Southeast Asian, precisely because the material culture there is so difficult from a provenance kind of object history point of view. The project, one of the projects that we're most excited about is working with the National Museum in Phnom Penh, in Cambodia, working on an exhibition with them, co-curating an exhibition for items that have been repatriated to Koh Kay, that extraordinary site in the north. So the answer to your really good question is, within the constraints, financial and energy, how do you expand your collection, expand your program in a way that addresses national needs, enriches an understanding of Chinese or Japanese art, for instance, Korean art. The more one understands Korean art, the better one understands aspects of Chinese and Japanese art history and collecting history, but to do so in a way that is sensitive to these new standards of collecting. So it's hard, takes a while, but check back in 5 years, in 10 years, we'll have lots of progress to report.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Elaine Kwok. Hi, Chase. Nice to see you. I want to ask about geopolitical relations. Given the, let's say, decades of mounting US-China tensions, and then with MAGA, with the whole tariffs thing, this looks like it's an isolationist policy of the US, not just with China, but maybe with other parts of the world as well. For the longest time, it felt like higher education was, immune or at least protected from this. There were still a lot of exchanges going on in academic circles. Well, maybe not completely protected, but relatively protected. The last couple of weeks have turned all that on its head. I am heartened to see that you are still here and there are great projects and loans and collaborations going on. I saw recently that Max Hollein from the Metropolitan Museum of Art was in Tokyo as well, was in Japan discussing loans, exhibitions. So I'm thinking maybe museums is where now it's relatively one of the few areas where this sort of international collaboration is still happening, still encouraged. I just want to see if, what you thought might be the vulnerabilities, if you think there is any kind of policy or, any sense that the tide will turn, that this will not continue to be still a wonderful ground for international exchange, or, we can all be optimistic, but I'm also curious if you've heard anything else.
So, I'm going to answer autobiographically, if I may. That sounds a bit self-indulgent and a bit oblique, but I think it's probably the best I can do. My father was born in China. Two-thirds of my education was abroad. My children are multi-ethnic and binational. And I'm not extraordinary at all. I think that's increasingly a kind of 20th century norm, 21st century norm. And the reason I say that is that I believe, and try as you might, you will not get me to comment on policies or politics. But as a historian, I will say that the forces of globalization and interdependence are so far advanced that I think it's structural. So the self-indulgent, if I may, part of the answer is I am myself an embodiment of internationalism or exchange or cosmopolitan, call it what you will. But I also believe that there is, this is a point my colleague made, there is a real appetite for that. There's a real appetite for the international. You can see it in the way popular culture is consumed, and you can see it in the way that high culture is globalized. You know, I think it's a lovely thought. I want it to be true, and I hope it to be true, that museums can play a really important role in kind of navigating these uncertain times.
Thank you for the answer, actually, because that's something that I would like to know more about. Well, thank you for sharing a personal story again on stage. I think that shows some personal mission, personal vision in line with your previous career path too. So I think if we don't have any more questions, so the Fireside Chat will end here. It's really a great pleasure to have you here. So I'll hold my questions and wait till the dinner time.
Thank you, Jianfei. Thank you, Chase. Thank you all for being here. And I think what you just said, thank you, Lang, for that question that I was going to ask, but I was going to save Chase from, I was going to ask you at dinner that question, but you asked a perfect question. And thank you. This is why Asia Society is all about, and also what Smithsonian, NMAA is all about. It's time like this. Organizations like us are more important than ever. Having just spent about 3 weeks in the US, and I went to several museums. I didn't get to NMAA this time. I did go to the Met, and I did go to Minnesota, EMEA, and all of that. And I'm saving. I am coming in November, so your Korean show, I will be there to see it but I've been every year I go, and in fact one of my favorite show was at it was still called the other name then. It was a show, just two objects, and this just shows the creativity and the originality, ingenuity of this museum. It was called I think Red, Ming Dynasty, Mark Rothko. It was a Mark Rothko's famous red painting, and right next to a beautiful Ming plate in red, and that was just it. And that's the beauty of this wonderful museum. And I think it's times like this that, we really need to support organizations like that. I remember just driving down the street. I was listening to the news. This was around the time of the students' visa being held and tariff. And I used to listen to NPR all the time driving in the US, National Public Radio, and I just couldn't stand the news anymore. There was no positive news. And I just switched to the classical radio station, and I was calm driving into DC. And then that's the same feeling of going to a museum, and the same feeling of reading that wonderful 2 weeks ago, because the headline was so negative. Remember, it still is negative, but reading that headline of the deaccession and the return, and that's a time like this. We do still have good news and collaboration. And I really do agree with you about collaboration and really commend you for what your leadership and what you're doing. And really thank you all for joining us this evening, this rainy night, and continue to support museums and support organizations, institutions that you believe in. Like this rain, this torrential rain, it's not going to last forever. It'll come and it'll go. And we've had typhoons before. And speaking as an American, as a Chinese American, really nervous about what's happening in the U.S. But at the same time, we can do something about it. And there are things that we can do. And here in Hong Kong, I have to say, it was really wonderful coming back to Hong Kong. But I think it's still, there is still collaboration. And I see so many of you in the field that, I see Winston there. I see all of colleagues, and I really commend you. The work we do now is going to be more important than ever. And it's, keep up all the good work. And same to you, Chase. Thank you. So enjoy the rest of the evening. I hope the rain has stopped, and look forward to seeing you at future program. We're going to have a really busy summer, and please come back and see us. Thank you. Thank you, Jianfei.